gives me great pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, Professor Robert Koons. Rob is a professor of philosophy at the University of Texas at Austin in the United States. He's the author of, amongst other books, Realism Regained, An Exact Theory of Causation, Teleology and the Mind, published by Oxford University in 2000. And more recently, Is Thomas Aquinas' Philosophy of Nature Obsolete?, published a couple of years ago by St. Augustine Press. He's also the co-author with Timothy H. Pickavants of The Atlas of Reality, a comprehensive guide to metaphysics, from Wiley Blackwell, 2017. Rob has co-edited The Waning of Materialism from 2010 for OUP, as well as 2 volumes for Routledge, depending on these being Neo-Aristotelian Perspectives on Contemporary Science, 2018, and Neo-Aristotelian Metaphysics and the Philosophy of Nature, 2021. He's done work also on Aristotelian interpretations of quantum theory, on the contemporary defense of Thomism, and arguments for classical theism. And correct me, Rob, if I'm wrong, but if I'm not mistaken, there's also a forthcoming collection in the pipeline on classical theism, entitled Classical Theism, co-edited for Routledge with Jonathan Foucault. It's already out, is it now? Okay, all right. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Rob, who will be giving a lecture entitled The Prime Mover from Aristotle to Aquinas, A Fresh Interpretation and Defense.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Carl, very much. Yes, my first visit to Poland, and I'm really excited to be here. Arrived on Sunday, so I was able to spend yesterday visiting this beautiful city of Cracow. Really very much enjoyed that, and honored to be part of this conference. Thank you very much for the invitation. So naturalism can mean many different things. I think I would say I'm definitely a Christian philosopher, and I'm definitely not a naturalist, whatever naturalism is. But I'm going to take naturalism at least to imply that all of reality, or at least all of reality that we can know, is contained, wholly contained by space and time. So if one can have an argument that shows that there's something, a real thing with real power and agency that's totally beyond time, totally non-temporal, then I would take that to be a proof that naturalism is false in any case. And it would put us on the path towards an even more robust kind of non-naturalism, I think, if we can establish such a thing. So I'm going to go back to one of the very earliest arguments against naturalism, so understood. The argument, Thomas Aquinas' First Way, which of course is based on the even earlier argument by Aristotle in the Physics, the argument for the unmoved mover. Now this is an argument which is, well, I should mention also, this is part of a larger project. My colleague Daniel Bonavac and I at University of Texas are working on a manuscript on all 5 of the 5 ways. And in each case, a contemporary interpretation and defense of the argument. These arguments, of course, are among the most famous arguments in philosophy, but we think are still relatively under-examined and certainly underappreciated. There's a large meeting taking place right now in Notre Dame on celebrating Thomas Aquinas' 800th anniversary, and there's about 100 papers there, not a single paper on the 5 ways, either individually or collectively. So even Thomists are sometimes, I think, somewhat embarrassed by the 5 ways, and this is especially true of the First Way, which is often thought to be both based on outdated mechanics of Aristotle and of medieval thinkers, and also failing to reach any kind of metaphysical conclusion, which is an objection, very early objection by Suarez, and I think probably was also Scotus's view, since he totally ignores the First Way in his treatments of God's existence. So I'm going to argue that to the contrary, the First Way and the argument from motion does not depend in any way on outdated science, and that it does reach quite rich metaphysical conclusions. So I'm going to swimming against the stream here quite dramatically. Very interested in hearing your feedback and just comments on this. Let's see. So here's an overview of the argument. I'm going to talk about the structure of the argument itself. I'm going to bring up 4 interpretive problems. These are pretty well-known problems. Then I'm going to get into some solutions to those problems. Why do changes need imminent causes? Aristotle's dynamic theory of time. So here I'm going to argue that really to understand the argument in Physics 7 and 8, you have to go back to Physics 4 and look carefully at Aristotle's theory of time. And that will lead to a principle of metaphysical proportionality, and especially to my consideration of why does time pass. So from an Aristotelian perspective, there's an important question here that needs an explanation. That will make me then turn to things like inertia and spontaneous self-movers, things that are supposed to be objections to the argument. Why not infinite regress? And then finally, arguing that we can get from an unmoved mover to something really metaphysically interesting, a timeless agent, an agent that's outside of time altogether. So here, I'll go through real quickly the text. I'm not going to spend time to actually read this. This is a standard translation of the first way into English with a few notations. But I just notice here, of course, one thing I should mention is that the word motion, as it's translated here as well, as you know in Latin, refers to change more generally, not just locomotion. So I will typically just use the word change in the talk. And also you'll notice that the notions of potentiality and actuality figure very prominently in this. And this, I think, will be the key to understanding the argument. We've got in paragraph 2, we've got an argument against circular causation in the relevant respect, that something can't cause itself to change in this respect. And then finally, in paragraph 3, an argument against an infinite regress. Which leads us to a first mover. And then, of course, the infamous conclusion that this everyone understands to be God. I'll try to explain what that means and why, in what sense we can understand that to be true. So here's sort of a formal representation of the argument, very simple structure of the argument. Thomas, I think, tacitly assumes that causation is transitive. So if it isn't, we'll just introduce a cause star notion, which is the transitive closure of causation. So if A causes B and B causes C, A cause star B C, right? So we can close the transitivity there. So there's basically just 3 assumptions of the argument. Non-emptiness, that there are changes. There's a non-empty domain D of changes. Seriality, that wherever there's a change, there's some state that causes the change state. So causation applies universally here within the domain of changes. And then finitude, there's no infinite descending causal chains, and therefore no circles either. Those are both excluded by finitude. And that gives us, of course, the result that there's an actually existing first cause of changes, a cause which lies outside the domain of changes. And every change is caused, star, by some such first cause. Right? So there's some non-change, right? At least one, that's the ultimate cause of the changes that we see in the world. Now Thomas assumes this first cause must be a mover, a causer of change, a thing that exercises the power to cause changes in other things. So this is basis of an Aristotelian causal powers theory of causation. So I'm just going to assume that that's correct for this talk, that where there's causation, there's a causal power that's being exercised by something. So that gives us a corollary then that there's an actually existing unmoved mover, a thing that exercises its power to cause changes in other things without thereby undergoing any change itself, any change whatsoever, right? Because if it undergoes any change in the process of changing, then we would have, again, an infinite regress. It wouldn't be a first cause. Okay? Now that sounds like maybe an unexciting conclusion, but I'm going to argue towards the end that it's actually quite important, quite interesting conclusion. Now there's 4 interpretive problems that this simple argument might face and historically has faced. First of all, why must every change have a cause? And why must this cause be a mover as opposed to something else, like a law of nature or something like that?
Something went wrong. Please try again.
Sorry. My phone has decided to talk on its own for some reason. Let's see if I can turn that off. Sorry. Over here. Secondly, why couldn't there be, maybe it's a logical fallacy detector, I don't know, I hope not. Secondly, why couldn't there be cases of a self-moving or spontaneous agent, right? Why do we have to always move to something further, so to speak? Now, Thomas gives in this second paragraph, as you know, a very brief argument against self-movers, why something couldn't change itself. First of all, nothing can be both actual and potential in the same respect at the same time. That seems reasonable, right? It can't be merely potentially hot and actually hot at the same time, right? If x changes y at time t, there's some respect r in which x is actually r at t and y is only potentially r at t. This at least seems to be what he's assuming, right? That in order for something to cause the wood to become actually hot, we need an agent that's also actually hot, and the wood is only potentially hot, such that the agent can act on the wood. And therefore, it follows from A and B that nothing can change itself, because in order to change itself, it would both have actuality and mere potentiality at the same time in the same respect. But the problem with this way of interpreting his argument in the second paragraph is that premise B is problematic, even in Thomas's own conceptions of nature. Aquinas admits there are many cases in nature of causation that's equivocal, where the cause does not have the property that it produces in the thing itself. So a very simple case is the sun. The sun on Aristotelian pictures is not hot, and yet nonetheless causes things to be hot. And so that's a counterexample to B, and without B, how do we get an argument here against self-movers? So that's the second problem. The third problem is, why couldn't we have an infinite series of causes, extending infinitely far back into the past to explain present motion? Both Aristotle and Thomas concede that infinite regresses, when they are infinite only accidentally, only per accidens, are possible. So it seems that the present motion could be explained by a temporally extended regress stretching infinitely far into the past. Aristotle and Thomas admit that such regresses are possible, so why not in this case? And then problem 4, the gap problem. Why must an unmoved mover have any of the characteristics of God? Why must it be eternal, timeless, necessary, lacking accidents, radically simple, and so on? Not to mention all-powerful, all-knowing, and all those other things. So I'm going to take up the question of the first problem, I guess it was. Why must changes have causes at all? So in Aristotle's cosmology, of course, the universe is infinitely old, and so motion has been going on forever. So to cause a motion is not to cause it to begin. So Aristotle thinks the motions of the spheres are caused, and yet the motion is not caused to begin because it never began. It's always been moving in the way that it is. Now, the traditional interpretation of this is that for every motion occurring at time t, there must be a simultaneous cause if it's continuing to move, also acting at time t, and that simultaneous infinite regresses are impossible. This is what we might call the traditional interpretation. And the way I understand this interpretation is that it demands there be a kind of mechanical chain of simultaneous causes. When I was a child, I used to play a game where you would put various gears on a board, and then eventually when you completed it, you could turn the gear over here, and it would turn the other gears, and then it would cause something to happen at the other end of the board. And I think this is the picture people have of Aristotle's mechanics, that there's a kind of chain, a series of gears leading from the spheres up above, and if the spheres stopped moving, all the gears would stop, and all the motion in the world would stop, and so therefore there has to be something that's constantly revving the whole thing up, constantly turning some kind of crank to keep the whole thing moving. The problem with that, I think, is that, first of all, that whatever is turning the crank, right, it will itself be continually changing as it turns the crank for each moment, and so it would fail to be a first or unmoved cause. And secondly, and even more importantly, in Aristotle's own mechanics, which Thomas well understands, there are many natural bodies capable of sustaining perpetual motion on their own, based on their own natures. So this picture of this chain, this linking of gears that somehow has to be in motion in order to move things is just wrong. The heavenly spheres themselves move the way they do because it's their nature to move that way. There's nothing that has to keep pushing them to do so. And likewise, heavy bodies, for instance, move naturally towards the center of the universe in Aristotle's picture. Nothing has to push the pen down in order to make that happen. So this interpretation seems to be false even on Aristotle's own mechanics. Doesn't seem to make sense of the text. So there's two possible answers. One answer is to appeal to something like the principle of sufficient reason. So one might say, well, yes, of course, the spheres keep moving of their own nature, but we might ask, why do they move the way they do? Why do they move from east to west rather than west to east? Why don't they move faster or slower than they do? And maybe for that you need a first cause. Well, perhaps, but it wouldn't be a compelling response, because the skeptic could always say, well, I can appeal to the nature of the spheres. It's the nature of the sphere to rotate the way it does. It's the nature of the body to move towards the center of the earth. I don't need any further explanation in order to make sense of that. So I think a better solution is to turn to Aristotle's, as I say, dynamic theory of time. So here we have to distinguish between two fundamentally different theories of time. This is not the familiar A theory, B theory distinction, if you know that. I think it's completely independent of that distinction, but it's another equally important distinction between what I call a geometrical and a dynamical theory of time. So with the origin of modern science, many philosophers shifted to a geometrical theory of time, in which time is a kind of dimension, very much like a spatial dimension, stretching into the past and into the future. And on this picture, change is what Bertrand Russell described as an at-at theory. That is, something changes if it is cold at one time and not cold or hot at another time. So just having different properties at different locations along this temporal dimension is all that change consists in. On a dynamic view, instead, time is defined as the measure of change. So you can't define change in terms of time. You have to define time in terms of change, right? That's the difference between the two. I'm assuming that you can't define them both in terms of each other. That would be viciously circular. So if time is the measure of change, then change cannot be defined in terms of time. It cannot be an at-at theory of change instead. Instead, what Aristotle does do, and he recognizes this very clearly, he defines change in terms of potentiality and actuality, not in terms of time. So he gives a completely non-temporal definition of time. There's this infamous statement in physics that change is the actuality of potentiality qua potentiality, whatever that means. And I'll try to explain, actually, in this talk what that means.
Did you say a non-temporal definition of time or a non-temporal?
Sorry, I meant a non-temporal definition of change. Yes, sorry, thank you for catching that, yes. So take, for instance, Zeno's paradox of the arrow. How does an arrow remain at rest, remaining at rest at t, differ intrinsically from an arrow in motion? Right? Zeno's problem is, if you look at the arrow, if you think there's no such difference, then the arrow at each moment in time is basically at rest. And so if it's at rest at every moment from the beginning to the end of its motion, then it's not really moving at all. It's always at rest, right? And I think what Aristotle would suggest here is that we have to distinguish, in a sense, two logical moments associated with each instant of time, t. So there's a t0 and t1 reflected at each time t. So if the arrow is at rest at time t, then it's actual at t in both logical moments, both prior and later logical moment. But if it's in motion, then it's only potentially at L in moment t0 and actually at L in moment t1. And I think the way to understand these two moments is that it's potentially at that position in itself and actually at that position through another, through an ultimate mover, so to speak, right? So there is, in a sense, at every instant in time, a kind of transition from potentiality to actuality that has to take place on Aristotle's picture, right? This is why you can define change without introducing time in his account of things. So a remote mover can elevate a state of an object from first to second potentiality. So let's suppose that we've got a bowling ball and it's rolling across the floor, and at exactly 10 o'clock it will hit the opposite wall, right? So the bowler introduces the ball into motion. And in doing so, and as the ball moves, at 10 o'clock, the ball is now in a state, thanks to the bowler and its motion, it's now in a state what we call second potentiality to hit the wall. That is, it's potentially hitting the wall, and it's primed to be actual. In fact, it can't be anything else but hitting the wall at 10 o'clock, right, because of its prior motion. But it's not yet actually hitting the wall. To be actually hitting the wall, you need something else. You need something that has actuality at time t in order to actualize the end of that process. So basically what I'm going to claim here is that every open interval of motion in time requires something at the final moment of time, t, that's already actual in order to close that open interval and to produce the state, elevate that state from second potentiality to actuality, to full actuality. So therefore, Thomas can concede that a change at t might have an infinite regress of these partial causes that are capable of bringing the change at t to a state of second potentiality. But he doesn't have to accept that there could be an infinite regress of total causes going back into the past, nor could there, so anyway, I'll go skip over that. So let me go on to this point about metaphysical proportionality. So remember the little argument I gave against self-motion and the problem with that argument. In the first way text, Thomas, excuse me, Thomas refers to a case of what we would call univocal, or he would call univocal causation, namely fire, which is already actually hot, causing the wood, which is only potentially hot, to become actually hot, right? But what about equivocal causation, right? What about the sun that makes the wood to become actually hot, even though the sun is not actually hot itself? But it's such a case of equivocal causation still satisfies a principle we might call a principle of metaphysical proportionality. So if an actual change is caused, it must be caused by something equally actual, right? Merely potential facts don't cause actual changes. So in the example, I think Thomas chose the example poorly, or explained it somewhat poorly. It sounds as though the fire had to be actually hot in order to make the wood hot. But what Thomas really means is that the fire had to be actually something, right, at time t, in order to make the wood potentially anything, actually anything. Right? So it's the actuality, potentiality that's crucial here, not heat or non-heat or hot or cold. So this leads us then to this problem about why does time pass? So again, if you have a geometrical theory of time, in which time is simply a spatial dimension, then there's no real question as to why time passes. Why does time move forward? Any more than you might say, why does space end? Why does space not end here? Why is there further space to the north? Time just stretches out there naturally. But if you have a dynamical theory of time, in which time is the measure of change, and change is fundamental, so no change, there's no passage of time, the question of why time keeps passing is actually a very important question, and a question for which we need a causal explanation. Now, if we try to appeal to the natures of things, like the natures of the spheres or the nature of the earthly object, to explain why time passes, we'd find ourselves in a problem. And that is that the nature of the sphere, for example, is such that it's going to keep moving in a certain way, right? But that's a time-dependent phenomenon, or a conditional phenomenon. That is, the nature of the lunar sphere, let's say, is that it will keep moving in the same way at 10 a.m. if 10 a.m. itself arrives, right? But it doesn't explain how any event at 10 a.m. will become actual. It's simply saying that if time passes, if time moves forward, I will keep moving forward in the same way. And you can see this is how our modern idea of inertia works as well. Inertia says, if a body is in motion at a certain velocity and no force acts on it, and if time proceeds in the usual sort of way, then at the new moment of time, it will still be moving at the same velocity. But inertia is a time-dependent phenomenon. It's a time-conditional phenomenon. It doesn't explain why time passes. It only says if time passes, things will continue to move in the same sort of way. So therefore, inertia and other kinds of essences of things in time cannot explain the forward motion of time itself. Now, here I think we have to introduce a complexity to the picture. And that is that we have to distinguish, of course, between actuality and potentiality. But we also have to recognize that things in the past do not cause things to happen in the present, and things in the future do not cause things to happen in the present. So we really have to distinguish between different modes or different ways of being actual. Things in the past are actual, but they're actual in a different way than the things that are actual in the present. And the principle of proportionality should say that in order for something to cause an actual change in mode M, the actor must also be actual in mode M, in the same mode. Right? So for change to occur at time t, something has to make a transition from potentiality to actuality in the mode that's appropriate for time t. And the thing that causes that change will also have to be already actual in that same mode. That's that mode that's appropriate to time t. So actions, therefore, that occur in the past and the future are at the time of the passion or the change merely potential. So at least relative to the mode that's appropriate to the change that's going at time t. So there's really only two possibilities to fully cause a change at time t. Either a simultaneous agent or an agent that's outside of time. Agents that are acting in the future or in the past are constrained or limited by time in such a way that they cannot act directly on a change that's occurring now. Now consider the aggregate of all changes occurring at time t, occurring at exactly 10 a.m. This aggregate is itself a change, right? It's one gigantic, very complex change occurring at time t. And so it must have a cause. its cause cannot be the action of a simultaneous agent, simultaneously acting agent. So such an agent would have to change. It would have to change either from not having the power to act at time t to having the power to act, or from having the power and not exercising that power to having the power and exercising the power at time t. So in either case, an agent that's in time would have to change at time t in order to act on time t. And that means that its change would be included in this aggregate of changes that we're talking about at time t. So an agent that's acting simultaneously can't cause this totality of changes, since its change to an agent will be included, right? There would be a circularity if it was if a simultaneous agent were actually causing it. And it can't be caused by an agent acting later or earlier, because agents that are acting earlier or later have the wrong kind of actuality, the wrong mode of actuality. They're not able to act directly on the present moment. So therefore, it must be by let's rule out the future. Let's consider the past action or a timeless agent still. So I'm going to argue that the past is always insufficient to explain the passage of time. So let's say that we're concerned now about what happens at TF. This is some final point of time. We want to know, why do changes occur at time TF? Why does TF itself become actual? Why are there any changes occurring there at all? And let's say we're going to refer to a process that's occurring up to but not including time TF, some open interval of changes that are occurring up to that time. Let's call that process P. Now, any such process P can then be divided into two sub-processes, P0 and P1, an earlier part of the process and a later part of the process. And then it's clear that P0, the earlier part, does not directly act on time TF. P0 causes some changes that are in P1. P1 acts on TF. And so we can say that really it's not the whole process, it's only the later part of the process that could possibly be causally relevant to the change that occurs at TF. But of course, any such process, if Aristotle's right and time is continuous, any such process could be divided, at least potentially, into an infinite number of parts, such that there's no part that's immediately adjacent to time TF. Every part is separated from T by some finite period of time from TF, and yet this whole series of P0, P1, P2, P3, so on, ad infinitum, adds up to our original process P. So any continuous process that goes up to TF but doesn't include TF can be broken up into in this way, and such that every part is separated from TF by a finite temporal distance, and so is inert, is incapable of acting on TF. But process P then is completely made up of things that are incapable of acting on TF. And so therefore P itself cannot act on TF. Any process that doesn't actually reach time TF is going to be causally incapable of making a difference at TF, at least of raising things from second potentiality to actuality. So, anything entirely composed of things that are not actual at TF cannot itself be actual at TF, and so cannot be causally responsible for any changes there. Now, if you reply by saying, well, maybe the whole process acquires a causal power that's not possessed by any of its parts. So maybe by the end, the whole process somehow has a power to act at TF. But I can always ask, when does that process achieve that power? It can only be at TF itself. That's the only time in which the process could acquire that power. So again, that would be a change in the process from not having that power to having the power. And so that change would again be part of our totality of changes C, and so couldn't be the ultimate explanation for the occurrence of C. So again, what about inertia and spontaneous self-movers? As I mentioned, inertia cannot explain the passage of time. Since inertia is a time-dependent phenomenon, it's conditional on the passage of time. Bowling ball rolling down the wall cannot explain why changes occur at 10 a.m. We can only say that if 10 a.m. arrives, if there are changes at 10 a.m., then the ball will be moving in the same way as it has been by inertia. And similarly, spontaneous temporal agents cannot explain the actualization of instants of time. So suppose that I have an ability through free will to act spontaneously, right? I have to, in order to exercise that power at time t, I've got to already be actual at time t. I've got to have the power to act at time t. And a temporal agent that acts at time t will have to change from not exercising a power to exercising a power at time t. So no temporal agent can be the ultimate explanation for the changes that are occurring at t, because it will have to change in order to contribute to any change that is occurring at time t. So why not an infinite regress of movers? This is a bit complicated point. I think I have time actually to go into it a bit here. Thomas famously distinguishes between regresses that are per se infinite and those that are accidentally infinite. And the per se infinite ones are impossible, according to Thomas, and the accidentally infinite ones are possible. And so there's a great debate about what exactly Thomas means by this distinction. What's the essence of the distinction? Why are the per se infinite ones impossible and the accidental ones possible? Thomas himself, I think, does not assume, as many people think he does, that all per se regresses are simultaneous, nor that all accidentally infinite regresses are temporally extended. So I think that I mean, there's a passage in Scotus that most people interpret as interpreting Thomas correctly here, but I disagree with that interpretation myself. The real issue, I think, is that if you have an accidentally infinite regress, then all the things that belong to the regress can be lumped together into one gigantic cause. And you can ask, what causes that? Right? What causes the totality of causes, so to speak? Whereas if you have a per se infinite regress, you can't aggregate it. You can't lump it together. And therefore, you can't ask, what's the cause of the whole thing? Right? I think it's pretty clear when you look at Thomas's discussions of per se infinite that that's actually what he has in mind. So let's consider what would be relevant here. Now, for the reasons that I've given, first of all, an accidentally infinite regress, well, first of all, let's say, for the reasons I've given, the only kinds of regresses that would be relevant to this argument would be simultaneous regresses. Any regress that goes back in time will fail to explain the arrival of the new moment of time. So the only question is, could there be an infinite regress at time tf, an infinite regress of causes? And I think the argument is, the best argument here is to say that, any set of changes that are occurring at the same time can be aggregated into one gigantic change. And we can ask, what causes that? It just seems pretty obvious to me, intuitively, that if there's a bunch of changes that occur at time tf, even if they themselves are related causally to each other in such a way as to form a regress, we can still ask, yeah, but why did the whole regress appear at time tf? What brought that whole thing into existence? And if that's right, then it's only the simultaneous per se infinite regress that would threaten the soundness of the first way. And what would that be like? I like very much Barry Miller's account in 1992. It's sort of an analogy of the distinction between per se and accidental regresses. So in Barry's picture, an accidental regress of M1, M2, M3, and so on goes something like this. M1 is caused by M2, and M2 is caused by M3, and M3 is caused by M4, and so on ad infinitum. So you just have a chain in which each case there's a complete causal connection between the thing and its successor. And it seems like in that kind of case, it's easy enough to just say, well, let's take the aggregate of M1, M2, the whole shebang, and ask, what causes the whole thing? In the other case, a case of an essentially infinite regress, instead you would have a case where at each step, you're going up at a kind of ontological chain. You're going to something that provides a deeper explanation for what's going on. So M1 is caused by, not just by M2, but M2 insofar as it's caused by M3, but that only insofar as it's caused by M4, so that you need to keep going up the chain in order to explain what's going on even at the lowest level. And as Miller points out, the resulting sentence here isn't really a sentence. We don't even have any idea of how to evaluate this because we've never actually completed a predicate. There's no way to evaluate this as true and false as opposed to the first example. So I think something along those lines makes sense, that there's a kind of logical incoherency in the idea of a per se infinite regress. And in the case of an accidental infinite regress, you can always just aggregate all the changes and ask what the cause is of the totality. And so regresses aren't really an issue here. So finally, the final problem, how do we get from an unmoved mover to something like God, right? This again, Suarez talks about this quite a bit, right? At most, you get some kind of physical object that's not changing. How does that get you to God? How does that even get you beyond naturalism, you might say, in relevance to this conference? Now I'm going to say that an unchanging but temporal, time-bound agent could not explain the passage of time, since it would have to be constantly changing in order to effect different changes at different times. Right? So the only thing that could possibly work here would be a timeless agent. Right? An agent that by means of a single non-temporal action causes all the changes that are required for time to keep moving forward. Right? Now this of course raises the old objection from Al-Ghazali and others in the Kalam tradition. How could a timeless agent produce effects in time? And the answer, I think, is only by being something like an intentional agent. So I like to use the example of an author and a book, author and a novel. So J.R.R. Tolkien, one of my favorite authors, wrote a long series of books called The Lord of the Rings. In those books, he introduces or defines a whole new timeline: first age, second age, third age, fourth age of Middle Earth, right? And it doesn't make any sense to ask, did Tolkien write The Fellowship of the Ring during the second age of Middle Earth, or was it during the third age of Middle Earth? No, he didn't do it in any age of the Middle Earth, right? He did it in our time, not in the timeline that occurs within the Lord of the Rings, right? But how is that possible? How could Tolkien be responsible for changes in Middle Earth in the third age if he's not in the third age himself, right? Or any other age? And of course the answer is that by being a mind, he was able to conceive of the entirety of time in Middle Earth and create it in one fell swoop, so to speak. And presumably this is what the first cause must have done in this case as well. It must have conceived of the totality of time and said, let time happen, let time keep happening. And it can do that in a single timeless act. It doesn't have to be constantly changing in order to keep time going forward. So we can resolve, I think, all four of the problems that I raised at the beginning of the talk. Why must change be caused by an action of a mover? Because change has to be defined in terms of potentiality and actuality. And for change to occur, something has to be potentially something, but also actually that same thing at the same time, so to speak. And the only way to make sense of that is to say that it's potentially a certain way in itself, and actually that same way through another, through a mover. So this distinction between two kinds of potentiality and actuality requires a mover to be in the picture. Why can't we appeal to the simultaneous action of a temporal agent or to inertia? Because both of these are time-dependent phenomena. That is, the action of a spontaneous agent at t cannot explain the arrival of time t itself. It presupposes that some changes occurred at t to make time t a time at which it could act. In the same way, inertia presupposes that time t has already arrived through some more basic change, such that it can continue moving in the same way. Problem 3, why couldn't an accidentally infinite causal regress be sufficient? Well, because if it stretched backward into time, it would be irrelevant, because all of the parts of that infinite regress would be separated from the present moment by a finite period of time, and so wouldn't explain why the new moment of time has arrived. And if it's simultaneously accidentally infinite, then an accidentally infinite simultaneous regress could be lumped together as a single gigantic change. And we can ask, what's the cause of that change? And that would again force us into a timeless agent. And finally, why must the first mover be God? Because it must be not just an unchanging being. In order to be an unchanging being in this context, it must be a non-temporal being. It must be a being that is not bound by time in any way. God must have a kind of actuality that is superior to, you might say, the actuality that's experienced by time-bound agents, such a way that he's able to act directly on every moment of time. He's not imprisoned by time in the same way that time-bound agents are. And so therefore he's able to cause these changes to occur without himself changing in any way. And then we can start asking, what would a being have to be like to be unchangeable? To be non-temporal. To be non-temporal, it would have to be unchangeable. To be unchangeable, it would have to lack any sort of intrinsic potentiality for change. To be lacking any intrinsic potential of change, it would have to be a being of pure actuality. Being of pure actuality, it would have to be a being of simplicity, and so on. So at least we're beginning on a path which will lead us towards God. Now, we still haven't gotten all the characteristics of God, of course. I haven't shown omnipotence, omniscience, benevolence, and so on. And I think when Thomas says, "This all men recognize as God," he's not claiming that the first way all by itself establishes all of the attributes of God. He's just saying it establishes one attribute of God that only God possesses, namely in this case is timelessness. That's the sense in which he thinks, okay, I've now demonstrated that there is this God, namely this being that's truly timeless. Okay, I guess I took care of that pretty good. So thanks very much for your patience. I hope that was reasonably clear, and hopefully we've got plenty of time for some questions. Thanks.